Joining us in the studio is Dr. Andreas Krieg, Senior Lecturer at the School of Security Studies at King's College London. Andreas, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, what is Israel up to in Syria exactly?
Now, for Israel, it had completely reshaped its grand strategy since the 7th of October, which is trying to create as many buffer zones as possible. It's trying to reshape the regional order in its own liking. And Israel, obviously, over the last 8 years, has never really integrated into the sort of regional context and the regional order. And what they're trying to do now is they're trying to undermine the regional order, and then leaving anything that all the territories, all the people, the communities outside its borders in constant limbo. So the overall strategic objective is weakening, is dividing, disrupting, and then keeping these countries on the periphery in some sort of limbo. So Israel is really not trying to construct or build. They've shown over the last 2 years, Netanyahu, by basically disrupting and destroying, he actually shows that he's not interested in building a sustainable sort of regional order that is built around stability.
Now, Israel has gotten itself involved militarily in Syria to, in their own words, protect the Druze community, specifically in Sueda. What exactly happened that escalated the situation between these kind of like inter-tribal disputes into something that has ultimately killed 1,200 people?
No, these were domestic Syrian problems, right? This is a country in formation right now. I mean, after decades and decades of authoritarian control, you now have a much more decentralized, almost networked order in Syria with different actors competing for power. And obviously, Sharaa is somewhat at the head of that network. He's kind of the hub in this kind of networked order, but he's not in full control and full charge yet. The security sector is extremely divided. There are all kinds of different militia groups roaming around, and then you see that all these different sectarian groups also have their own armed fighters. And so what we've seen in Sueda after the 12th of July is sectarian violence broke out between Bedouin tribes who attacked a Druze member of the Druze community. Druze tribes who already have, or members of the Druze community have their own fighters, then retaliated against these Bedouin tribes. And then we've got HTS and the government of Syria sending in their own forces, which themselves are not really integrated yet in a coherent security sector. So again, there is this sectarian idea of, at least a perception among Druze, that what al-Sharaa has been sending were these kind of, what the Druze saying are a kind of jihadist, takfiri sort of groups. But these were kind of the heart of the Syrian opposition to Assad, and they were sent in, and they tried to divide the warring faction, and then got drawn into this violence as well, and then exercised violence. So the accusations from the Druze is that now the government forces were also intervening and becoming a third party to which was a conflict between Druze on one side and Arab Bedouin tribes on the other. So it's basically a Syrian sectarian issue that then Israel has tried to manipulate for its own, and has been manipulating since December, frankly.
And the thing that complicates the situation is that there is also a Druze minority inside Israel that has a special relationship with the Israeli government. How would you explain that relationship?
It's a very complicated one. So the Druze obviously are a religious minority. They exist in Palestine, Israel, in Syria, and in Lebanon. But on the Syrians, they obviously are in that border corridor between Syria and Israel, on the Golan mostly. And so the Israelis understood if you want to control their territory, it would be good to control these communities. And so they were always a very important vehicle for Israeli, governance of the Golan Heights and governing that border with Syria, which for the Israelis was always of great concern. And apart from that, since the 1950s, there has been an attempt by the Israelis to kind of use this tiny minority. I mean, they're 1.2% of the Israeli public, trying to build that narrative of them being a minority group that is kind of a role model of how minorities could live side by side with Jews, allowing them to join the military, and also using them, again, for divide and rule domestically by saying these are the good Arabs, these are, a religious minority, and saying, this is a way for us to kind of separate the different minorities within Israel, and saying, look, the Palestinians, the Sunni Arabs, they're the problem, because look at the Druze, they can actually integrate. But that is a narrative that hasn't been absorbed by everyone in the community, in the Druze community. I think the Druze community is often seen as a monolith, but they're not. They're kind of divided even within Israel. And what we've seen over the last couple of years, especially since 2018 with the new nationality laws, is that this community that for decades was told that they're part of Israel and the Israeli fabric are actually not really part of the fabric anymore because they're not Jewish. And that has led to quite a lot of antagonism within the Druze community inside of Israel.
And when you look at the situation inside Syria over the last 6 months, since the fall of Bashar al-Assad, there has been this ongoing tension between the new government and different minority groups, whether they're the Druze or whether the Alawites or the Kurds. And the government has really tried somewhat unsuccessfully to bring about this new sense of unity. Again, not with the 80% of Sunni Arabs that make up the majority of the population in Syria, but with these minority groups. Why is that tension still there? And why is it so difficult for someone like President Ahmed al-Sharaa to try and bring all these people together?
It would have been difficult for any sort of actor, for any political leader in Syria to bring this very diverse group, this rig-rag of different ethnic groups together under one umbrella, because the Syrian identity has been broken by the regime because it was replaced by a Ba'athist regime identity. And now you're trying to build a new inclusive Syrian identity. That was never going to be a smooth transition. I think nobody was blue-eyed in December last year in 2024 thinking this would be a smooth transition, but it has been smoother than many people expected. But obviously we had on the fringes, on the periphery, quite a lot of sectarian violence, but quite tactical, nothing strategic. But we have these external actors who all have an interest in wanting al-Sharaa fail. They want to see al-Sharaa fail. So Iran is one. The Iranians want their influence back. They want, they have been stoking fears among Shia minorities and other minorities in Syria, saying the jihadists will never allow you to be members of that new public. We've got the Israelis with the Druze saying, here's another minority that's being marginalized and threatened by al-Sharaa. And then you've got the Russians who have been, siding with the Christians of saying, Christians are being marginalized by the HTS government. They don't have the same rights. Over Christmas, they were saying that they were attacked because they were setting up Christmas trees. All of them are information. These are all information campaigns, influence campaigns to kind of, kind of divide. And it's a part of divide and rule. It's about kind of making the consensus building effort that al-Sharaa is involved in so much more difficult. And I think it's the manipulation of genuine grievances, because they do exist and concerns do exist, but they're being manipulated through influence campaigns by Israel, Iran, and Russia. And so what we see around the southern corridor, and that's what the Israelis want, they want to manipulate the minority grievances to have a claim to that territory. And what we've seen since December 2024 is a gradual salami tactic that the Israelis have applied by taking ever more territory under the pretext of protecting minority rights, when in reality it's about, it's an Israeli state-building enterprise, if you will. It's a way of advancing their national interest.
You mentioned a number of these external actors. Now, on the other side, in support of the new Syrian government, there has been a host of other countries that have come to the aid of Ahmed al-Sharaa, have given them lots of support. They include, of course, the Gulf countries, lots of Arab countries, the United States in particular, and Donald Trump just kind of, when he met with Ahmed al-Sharaa, praised him, called him a fighter with a strong past. And there are many that would look at that with a little bit of suspicion and say, okay, what do these countries want to gain out of this relationship? Why are they backing this guy so blindly when other groups, and specifically minority groups, will have their own kind of suspicions or unease about what this new person at the helm of Syria has in store for the country?
No, look, geopolitics is not altruistic, right? Nobody does anything out of charity. So nobody should be under any illusion that the Gulf states, particularly Qatar and Saudi, or even the UAE, or Turkey, or the United States, or the European countries have all kind of now sided with Damascus and saying, we want stability. That they're doing this purely out of altruistic reasons. There are, geoeconomic reasons, there are geopolitical reasons to do that. But all of them have an interest in stability. I think most regional actors, including Turkey and the Gulf, and the United States as well, they want a stable region, and they understand a stable region depends on a Syria that is stable, and that there is a government that is inclusive, and one that is not suppressing any sort of minority. And after all, al-Sharaa is representing the biggest group within the country, and hence it makes sense to have him represent Syria. But it has been so far a fairly good, almost a role model type approach of how to build from scratch a sort of inclusive regional identity. But the problem here is, as I said, the Russians, the Iranians, and the Israelis want him to fail. So they're not interested in stability. For them, actually, a more unstable Syria serves their interest, because they can exploit this instability to advance their interest, mobilizing their sort of proxy and surrogate forces in the country, either to attack Israel from the Iranian side. The Israelis obviously want to just build instability because they don't want a stable, potential, robust and rich Syria that has a military and then could potentially eventually threaten Israel. And the Russians themselves don't want the US to expand their influence in the Middle East because for them, Syria was always the access to the Mediterranean. So I think there is a difference here. None of these actors externally is altruistic. I think there's a big difference, though, between what the Gulf states, Turkey, and the US want, because they do want stability.
Let's talk about Turkey, because obviously they have a lot of vested interest in Syria. They were involved militarily. They were trying to bring about a certain kind of security along their borders. They were fighting against the SDF and the YPG and other Kurdish groups. And when Sharaa came to power, they were giving him a lot of support to try and bring this unity specifically with the Kurds, because this is obviously in Turkish interests. What has happened over the last week and what has been happening with these sectarian tensions, does that threaten al-Sharaa's ability to then kind of follow through with these peace negotiations that he was having with the Kurds?
Now, I think there is a risk. I think we're not there yet, but there is a risk if he's seen as being weak in the south, as someone who is not honoring agreements, if he's seen as or being framed as someone who is undermining communal interest in the south. The Kurds, for example, in the north could say, actually, all the agreements we have with the government, maybe he will not honor those. And that could create kind of ripple effects and dominoes where the authority of al-Sharaa might be challenged. We're not there at all. I haven't seen anything that suggests that we're going down that route. But again, that's what Israel's interest is, by kind of saying he's a jihadist. He has his own takfiri, Islamic fundamentalist ideologies that are not irreconcilable with some of the minority interests. And so, we want to contain him. If he's the mayor of Damascus, that's quite good for the Israelis. They're quite happy for Assad to be the mayor of Damascus, as long as he didn't have a military power to threaten Israel. So containing him is exactly what the Israelis want. And the ripple effects in northern Syria are not really affecting the Israelis as of now. But that's obviously something the Turks are quite concerned with. But after all, the Druze are a very, very small minority in the country. And they need to be protected. I think nobody in Damascus suggests otherwise. But they don't have the mobilization power to really cause a serious challenge to Damascus. But if you have a protracted conflict in the south, which is a threat, because Israel could double down on support for the Druze fighters and provide, obviously the IDF is providing air cover for their operations, that could become a protracted conflict, and a protracted conflict that will over time gradually decrease the stability of the al-Sharaa government.
And you have somebody like Donald Trump, who is obviously very vested in bringing Syria into this like Abrahamic Accords. He was pushing normalization between Syria and Israel when he was in the Gulf. He's repeated that claim again. We know that U.S. officials have been trying to convince Syria to kind of negotiate in good faith with Israel. Then we see this U-turn from the Israeli side that not only takes the Syrians by surprise, but it takes Donald Trump by surprise. What happened there? Why are the U.S. and Israel not on the same page?
Now, the problem is, again, Donald Trump wants to get out of the region. He wants to leave a somewhat stable region that can administer itself, that doesn't require U.S. support, that doesn't require U.S. boots on the ground, whether in Iraq or in Syria or in Lebanon or in the Gulf vis-a-vis Iran. And Israel on every corner has done the exact opposite. They have, when it came to Iran, they, I would say, went against Trump and MAGA, especially the America First sort of constituency, who didn't want another war. The Israelis kind of triggered this war between Iran and itself, but also later on the US and Iran. They've done the same now in Syria, where, again, the policy in Washington suggests, let's leave it with al-Sharaa, let's support him, let's lift sanctions and build a stable Syria. And again, the Israelis are trying to upend it. And even so, the Trump administration said, okay, let's use the Abrahamic Accords as a tool to get more connectivity and exchange between Israel and the Arab world. And they even suggested that al-Sharaa is not entirely against it, although I think it would be quite a leap for him to actually go and normalize, considering what his background was. But that he's even entertaining this, that the pragmatism that al-Sharaa has shown is quite remarkable. But now you have Israel, despite the fact that he's suggesting if Saudi normalizes, we will normalize, that, despite all these steps that he's taken towards Israel, we're seeing the Israelis bomb their defense ministry in Damascus. I think that was a massive slap in his face. And also the credibility among his own key constituency in Syria for al-Sharaa, the jihadists who anyway naturally are not aligned with Israel in any way. I think it is very difficult for them to now swallow the pill of normalization after everything they've done. And I think that is kind of also a slap in the face of Donald Trump, who's been saying we're willing to be pragmatic, we're willing to strike deals with everyone, and we're even facilitating. And to be honest, any other Israeli government would probably have taken this offer and pursued an avenue of engagement. But it's Netanyahu who can't do it because he's in this constant limbo of making sure that that he stays out of court and that he stays in power. And so he's manipulating regional stability to ensure he will never have to step down.
And Israel and Syria were seemingly in the middle of security talks when this happened. They were trying to negotiate a lot of things around the border, the buffer zone. When, by taking a step like this, like by bombing the capital of the country that you're negotiating with, what message is the Israeli government sending to Ahmed al-Sharaa?
I mean, this Israeli government has no interest in diplomacy. I mean, they've been jeopardizing the Hamas Israel mediation going on in Qatar. They've been obviously undermining the talks that Oman was holding between the Iranians and the Americans, killing the negotiator actually on the first day that they struck Tehran. And now they're doing the same thing. I mean, they're striking the defense ministry when they're actually quite willing to come up with a territorial agreement that would actually see the Syrians potentially cede a lot of territory, the Golan Heights, to Israel. All great advances for Israeli interest. And despite all of this, whenever there is a diplomatic off-ramp being created, they're like, no, the only way we can succeed is the iron fist. And this is what Netanyahu said in his speech after the attack in Sueda last week, against Damascus. He was saying this was an act of strength by us that has given us a result. The problem is very short-termist. I mean, that's the issue. Netanyahu is a strategic procrastinator. He's not someone who's actually developing sustainable stability. What he's up for, what he wants to achieve, is basically short-term gains and long-term instability or manageable instability that Israel then can manage from afar, rather than actually coming up with a political solution to any of these various problems that Israel is surrounded with. And that's part of Israel's failing grand strategy in the region, to be honest.
Dr. Andreas Krieg, thank you so much for your analysis.
Great. Thank you.